You may hear a lot of riders talking about changing the gearing on their bike. And by changing the gearing on their bike, what they're referring to is changing the sprocket sizes. So in this video, I'm going to show you what that's all about and why even just a tiny little change in the number of teeth on this sprocket, like one tooth, will change the gearing of your bike quite a bit, and why that should matter to you. I'm going to break it down, make it simple so that you understand, and maybe make a change to your bike that you didn't know you needed. It's going to help you out quite a bit. Let's do it. So here's how the mechanics of it works. Assuming the front sprocket stays the same size, let's start with the rear sprocket. By increasing or decreasing the size of the rear sprocket, you're increasing or decreasing the amount of revolutions it will perform per one revolution of the front sprocket. So you know things are getting real when I pull out the whiteboard, right? Okay, so how does this actually work? Well, by changing the size of the rear sprocket, if you make the rear sprocket a little bit bigger, you're effectively changing the tire speed, the rotational speed of the rear tire. Because the front sprocket, it still has to do one full revolution as it normally does, and it's going to do that at the speed that it normally does. But if the rear sprocket has been made bigger, that's changing that gear ratio, which means you're effectively slowing the tire down, because for every revolution that this did, that translated into a full revolution here, because it's bigger, this is going to have to turn more to get this one to turn one more revolution. So you're slowing the bike down, but you're also increasing the amount of power coming out of the rear wheel. Okay, so a bigger sprocket means the tire is going to turn a little more slowly because you have increased the gear ratio. But by increasing the gear ratio, you're also increasing the torque at the rear wheel, which means it's going to feel like the bike has a little more power. But the drawback to that, of course, is the bike is going to feel slower, and it will be slower. Because like I said, this has to turn faster to get one more revolution, a full revolution out of the rear tire. So you'll have a lot more power, but the bike will be slower. Now conversely, if you shrink the rear sprocket, if you make the rear sprocket smaller, that's going to give you a closer to a 1-to-1 gear ratio, which is going to make the bike much, much faster, right? Because here's what happens. This thing will keep turning like it has been the whole time, and that's going to be closer to the same speed as this sprocket shrinks. This one's going to turn closer to the same speed this one is. Bike's going to be really fast, but it's not going to have much power. So what about the front sprocket? Can you change the teeth on those? And the answer is yes. But changing the teeth on the front sprocket has a much larger effect than changing the teeth on the rear sprocket. So just by way of mathematics, let's talk about some of the gear ratio stuff. So if we have 13 teeth on the front sprocket and we have 50 teeth on the rear sprocket, which funny enough is actually what you see here, this is what I used. The gear ratio is just 13 divided by 50. The gear ratio is going to be 0.26. Okay, now keep that in mind. Now if we drop one tooth on the rear, let's say we get one of tooth off the rear there, so now we have 49 teeth. 13 divided by 49 gives you 0.2653. Not much of a change, right? You might think to yourself, that's kind of insignificant, right? Well, let's check this. If we go to a 12 tooth on the front, so 12 divided by, we'll just go with that 50 again on the rear, that gives you a gear ratio of 0.24. Quite a drastic change. So one tooth on the rear, 0.2653, one tooth on the front, 0.24. Quite a bit of a bigger change. Okay, so we figured out if you add or subtract teeth on the sprockets, it changes the gear ratio, which means it will affect how fast the rear tire turns in relation to the RPM. Or in other words, how much gas you're giving it. But how much can you actually notice a one-tooth difference in, say, the rear sprocket? A lot. Like, a lot. Here's the thing. I recently dropped one tooth off my 2021 Honda 450F, and the reason I did that was because I felt like the bike was too powerful. Coming out of corners, you just touch the throttle and it just wants to go. I wanted something a little smoother, just a little more like I could roll it on and be a little smoother on acceleration out of corners or whatever that may be, and it didn't just want to jerk my arms off. So I went down one tooth on the rear. Now you're probably asking, Does it really make that much of a difference? Because remember here, when we did our calculations, 0.26 to 0.2653, it's not a huge swing. You might be thinking, well, why didn't you do one in the front if you really wanted that much of a change? One tooth on the rear sprocket completely changed the way the bike handles in corners, powers out of them and stuff. You'd be blown away by how much one tooth on the rear can change. One tooth going down, one tooth on the rear completely leveled out the bike for me. Now, I usually do corners in second gear. I find the power is way smoother. It doesn't want to jerk out of my arms. Plus, remember how I talked about when you shrink that sprocket, you make the bike a little faster? I can get a little more out of second, a little more out of third gear now than I had before. So I dropped the power down, which is what I wanted on the 450, just had too much. And I can get a little more out of second gear. So when I'm hitting some of the bigger jumps and I'm kind of like, I kind of should shift to third, but I'm not quite there yet. Now I don't really have to. It makes that much of a difference when you lose one tooth on the rear. Messing with the front sprocket, yeah, you can do it. And if you really know what you're doing, sure. But for the average guy, leave the front alone. Just do one at a time on the rear.
So if you're looking at doing some gearing changing on your bike, definitely start with your rear sprocket and only go one tooth at a time.
So like I said, I think you'd be pretty surprised at how much of a difference this can make. Look, I hope the video helped clear some stuff up, tried to explain why this gearing stuff changes things on the bike and whether or not maybe you want to add some speed or some power to your bike and how that's going to be affected by all this stuff. So when you go to order the sprocket and they ask, well, how many teeth do you want? And let's say the stock is 49 teeth. Now you'll actually have a more intelligent and more informed decision to say, I want to go up one tooth, or I want to go down one tooth, or whatever the case may be that you need to get out of your bike. But hope that helped clear it up a little bit. Hope you liked the video. Smash subscribe for me. You know I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in. See you in the next one.